It was a typical autumn night, and the roads were nearly deserted. Alex Palmer, a 32-year-old salesman, was driving back home from a conference in a neighboring city. The event had run longer than expected, forcing him onto the highway well past midnight. His car hummed steadily as the miles rolled under his tires, the GPS glowing faintly on the dashboard. The route took him through back roads and rural highways, shortcuts he wasn't familiar with but trusted to shave some time off the trip. The air outside was crisp, the darkness absolute save for the tunnel of light cast by his headlights. He checked the clock, 12:45 a.m., only 2 more hours until home. The unmarked road. The GPS chirped, signaling a left turn onto an unmarked road. Alex frowned. The asphalt looked weathered, its painted lines barely visible under his headlights. Thick trees crowded either side, their branches arching over the road like skeletal fingers. Great, Alex muttered. Shortcut through a horror movie set. Still, he followed the instructions. He trusted the GPS more than his gut, which had begun to twist uneasily the moment he turned onto the path. The silence. It wasn't long before Alex noticed how unnaturally quiet it was. He turned down the radio, listening. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of other vehicles, just the low growl of his car engine and the faint squeak of his windshield wipers brushing away a light drizzle that had started moments ago. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the creeping unease. It's just the woods, he told himself. Nothing out here but trees and maybe some deer. But the silence was oppressive, and as the minutes ticked by, it grew harder to ignore. The first glimpse. Up ahead, something caught his eye, a faint glimmer on the side of the road. At first, he thought it was a reflector or an animal's eyes, but as he drew closer, he saw it was a car. It was an older model sedan, its hood crumpled and one wheel off its axle. The driver's side door hung open. Alex slowed down, peering out the window. "Hello?" he called out, his voice swallowed by the night. No response. He debated stopping but thought better of it. It wasn't his problem, and something about the wreck made his skin crawl. He pressed the gas, speeding up as he passed the car. In the rearview mirror, he thought he saw movement near the trees, a shadow, quick and indistinct. The first figure. A few miles later, Alex spotted a figure walking along the edge of the road. It was a man, hunched over, his clothes dark and soaked from the rain. As Alex approached, the man turned toward the car, raising a hand in what looked like a plea for help. Alex's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. He slowed but didn't stop. Something about the man seemed off. His movements were jerky, almost unnatural, and his face, though partially obscured, appeared gaunt and pale. The man's arm dropped as Alex passed him, and in the rearview mirror, he watched the figure shrink into the distance. Then the man stopped walking. He just stood there, staring after Alex's car until the darkness swallowed him. The loop. Alex drove on, his nerves fraying with every mile. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees blurring together in an unbroken line. He checked the GPS, but the screen had frozen. It still displayed the same turn he'd made over half an hour ago. Frustrated, he tapped it a few times, but the image didn't change. The clock on the dashboard still read 12:45 a.m. "What the hell?" he muttered. His headlights flickered, the engine sputtered briefly, and then everything returned to normal. Except, up ahead, there was another car, a sedan, crumpled and broken in exactly the same way as the one he'd passed earlier. Alex's stomach churned. He slowed down, dread washing over him. The door was open just as before, and as he rolled by, he saw the same faint shadow darting into the woods. "This can't be happening," he whispered, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The voices. A few minutes later, Alex heard something strange. At first, it was faint, like static on a radio, but it grew louder with every passing second. Whispers. They were coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once, a chorus of low, murmuring voices that he couldn't make out. Alex turned off the radio, but the whispers didn't stop. They ebbed and flowed, rising to an almost deafening pitch before falling silent again. And then he saw it, the figure on the side of the road. It was the same man, hunched and drenched, raising his hand for help. The chase. This time, Alex didn't slow down. He kept his foot on the gas, heart pounding as he sped past the man. But the figure didn't stay behind. In the rearview mirror, Alex saw him running, sprinting after the car. His movements were inhumanly fast, his limbs bending in ways that made Alex's stomach turn. No, Alex shouted, his voice cracking. He floored the accelerator, the car roaring down the narrow road. The figure kept pace for a terrifying few seconds before vanishing into the darkness. The dead end, finally. After what felt like hours, Alex saw a light ahead. His chest swelled with relief as he realized it was an intersection. But as he reached it, he slammed on the brakes. The light wasn't an intersection. It was the same wrecked sedan, its headlights flickering weakly. The door hung open, and this time there was someone standing next to it. It was him. Alex stared, his breath hitching in his throat. The figure by the car was identical to him. Same clothes, same face, even the same horrified expression. The whispers returned, louder than ever, a cacophony of unintelligible words that seemed to come from within his own skull. The doppelganger raised a hand, pointing directly at Alex's car. The vanishing point. The engine sputtered and died, leaving Alex in complete darkness. He fumbled with the key, trying to restart the car, but it was useless. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and growing closer. Alex turned toward the sound, his eyes wide, but the darkness outside the car was absolute. He couldn't see a thing. The footsteps stopped just outside his window, and then a hand pressed against the glass. The aftermath. Alex's car was found 2 days later by a local patrol officer. It was parked neatly on the shoulder of an unmarked road, the engine cold and the driver's seat empty. Locals whispered about the road, saying it wasn't the first time a car had been found abandoned there. They called it the Silent Highway, a place where time stood still and travelers disappeared without a trace. No one ever saw Alex Palmer again. Jake Henderson tightened his grip on the steering wheel, the leather cool and familiar beneath his fingers. The clock on the dashboard glowed 11:23 p.m. as he drove through the desolate stretch of Route 44. The road cut through dense woods, the trees lining the sides like silent sentinels, their twisted branches casting jagged shadows under the pale light of the moon. Jake was on his way home after a late-night job at a construction site 2 towns over. He preferred night drives, fewer cars, fewer distractions, and the solitude gave him time to think. But tonight, something about the road felt wrong. The headlights barely pierced the darkness, the asphalt stretching endlessly ahead. Jake turned on the radio, flipping through stations, but all he found was static. With a sigh, he switched it off and settled into the eerie quiet. The stranger on the shoulder. 20 minutes into the drive, Jake spotted something ahead on the shoulder of the road. A figure stood just outside the beam of his headlights, their silhouette barely visible. As he got closer, Jake realized it was a man, waving one arm weakly. The other arm hung limply at his side, as if injured. Jake slowed the car, his instincts warring with caution. Stopping for strangers on empty roads at night wasn't exactly his style, but something about the man's hunched posture and the desperation in his gestures pulled at him. Rolling down the window, Jake called out, "Hey, you okay?" The man limped closer, his face pale and drawn. "My car broke down. I need help," he rasped, his voice hoarse and trembling. Jake scanned the road but saw no car. "Where's your car?" "Back there," the man said, gesturing vaguely behind him. Jake hesitated but nodded toward the passenger seat. "Get in. I'll take you to the next gas station." The man climbed in, wincing as he settled into the seat. He smelled faintly of sweat and damp earth, his clothes disheveled and streaked with grime. The conversation. "Name's Jake," he offered, trying to ease the tension. "Eric," the man replied, his voice flat. Jake waited for him to say more, but Eric just stared out the window, his expression unreadable. "How long were you out there?" Jake pressed. "Long enough," Eric muttered, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. Jake frowned but kept driving. The uneasy silence between them was punctuated only by the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The first glitch. About 10 miles down the road, Jake glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It still read 11:23 p.m. He tapped it, thinking it might have frozen, but it didn't budge. His phone, plugged into the charger, also displayed the same time. "Damn thing's broken," Jake muttered under his breath. Eric turned his head slightly. "Maybe it's not the clock that's broken," he said cryptically. Jake's stomach tightened at the comment, but he forced a chuckle. "What's that supposed to mean?" Eric didn't answer. The endless stretch. The road seemed to stretch forever, an unchanging ribbon of asphalt bordered by trees that grew denser with each mile. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he'd passed the same bend in the road several times. "Hey, you sure this road leads to a town?" he asked, glancing at Eric. Eric's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "It used to." "What do you mean, used to?" Jake asked, his irritation bubbling to the surface. Before Eric could answer, the headlights flickered, plunging them into darkness for a split second before flaring back to life. Jake cursed under his breath. The shape in the distance. A few minutes later, Jake spotted something up ahead. At first, it looked like an animal, a deer maybe, but as they got closer he realized it was something much stranger. A figure stood in the middle of the road, its form hazy and indistinct, as though it were partially hidden in a thick fog. Jake slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just feet from the figure. "What the hell is that?" Jake whispered, more to himself than to Eric. Eric stared at the figure, his face pale. "Don't look too long," he said, his voice barely audible. But Jake couldn't look away. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe. It was humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its proportions unsettling. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. The passenger's revelation. Jake's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice rising. Eric leaned back in his seat, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "You shouldn't have stopped." "What are you talking about?" Jake snapped. "This road," Eric said slowly, "it doesn't lead anywhere. Not anymore." Jake felt his stomach churn. What does that even mean? Eric turned to him, his eyes dark and hollow. "You were fine as long as you didn't stop, but now it knows you're here." The second figure. Jake tried to shake off Eric's cryptic words, but his nerves were shot. The road ahead was empty again, but the oppressive darkness seemed to press closer, the trees almost leaning into the car. Then, out of nowhere, another figure appeared at the side of the road. This one was smaller, hunched, and seemed to be clawing at the air. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette controlled by a clumsy hand. Jake swerved to avoid it, his heart pounding. When he glanced in the rearview mirror, the figure was standing in the middle of the road, watching them drive away. The loop. After what felt like hours, Jake saw something that made his blood run cold. The same figure, standing on the shoulder of the road. It was Eric. Jake slammed on the brakes, his head snapping toward the passenger seat. It was empty. The final revelation. Jake's breaths came in short, panicked gasps as he stared at the empty seat. The headlights flickered again, and for a brief moment the road was bathed in complete darkness. When the lights came back on, the figure in the road was gone, but so was the road. In its place was a void, an endless expanse of black that stretched in every direction. Jake screamed, but no sound came out. The aftermath. The next morning, a state trooper found Jake's car parked in the middle of Route 44. The engine was off, the doors locked, and the driver's seat was empty. Locals whispered about the road, calling it cursed. They warned travelers to avoid it at night, to never stop for anyone or anything. And they all agreed on one thing. Once you see the figures, you're already too late. Jason Miller adjusted his rearview mirror and sighed, his breath fogging in the chilly cabin. The clock on the dashboard blinked 11:47 p.m., its soft blue light casting an eerie glow. He was miles from the nearest town, cruising down Route 61, a remote stretch of road infamous for its long, empty miles. It was a route Jason knew well. He'd been traveling it for years to visit his parents, who lived 2 states over. Normally he found the solitude soothing, a quiet break from the chaos of the city. But tonight, something felt off. The road stretched endlessly into the dark, his headlights carving a narrow path through the void. The trees lining the highway were thick and unyielding, their gnarled branches forming dark, skeletal shapes. He turned up the radio, hoping for some company. A soft country melody hummed through the speakers, but it did little to calm his nerves. The strange reflection. As Jason approached a bend, his headlights caught something unusual. At first, it looked like a deer standing in the middle of the road, But as he slowed, he realized it wasn't an animal. It was a person, a woman, barefoot, wearing a pale dress that fluttered slightly in the breeze. Jason pressed the brakes, his car coming to a stop about 20 feet from her. She didn't move, didn't react. She just stood there, her head tilted downward. He rolled down the window and leaned out. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman slowly raised her head, and Jason's breath caught. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken, and her skin had a waxy, almost translucent quality. But it was her expression that unnerved him, a blank, hollow stare, as if she were looking through him. Jason's instincts screamed at him to leave. He shifted the car into reverse, but before he could press the gas, the woman suddenly turned and walked off the road, disappearing into the woods without a sound. The first omen. Jason's heart raced as he sat there, his hands gripping the steering wheel. After a few moments, he convinced himself it was just a lost traveler. Strange, sure, but not dangerous. He pressed on, his tires crunching over the cracked asphalt. The road seemed darker now, the trees denser. His headlights flickered once, then twice, before stabilizing. Jason glanced at his gas gauge. Half a tank, more than enough to get him to the next town. A mile down the road, he noticed something odd in his rearview mirror. At first, it looked like a faint shimmer, like headlights far in the distance. But the light didn't behave like headlights. It didn't grow brighter or closer. It just hovered, a steady pinprick of light in the otherwise black horizon. He shook his head. "Just tired," he muttered, focusing on the road ahead. But the light didn't disappear. The tap. Jason tried to distract himself by fiddling with the radio. The music cut out, replaced by static. He turned the dial, searching for a signal, but found nothing. Frustrated, he switched it off, leaving only the sound of the engine and the tires on the pavement. Then he heard it, a soft tapping. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the engine. Jason thought it might be a loose branch or a rock kicked up by the tires. But the tapping grew louder, more insistent. He glanced at the passenger side window. Nothing. Suddenly the tapping came again, this time from the back window. Jason's pulse quickened. He didn't dare look. Instead, he pressed harder on the gas, the car lurching forward. The tapping stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The loop. After another 15 minutes, Jason began to feel uneasy again. The trees looked identical, their twisted forms blending into one continuous mass. Every curve in the road felt like a repeat of the last. Then he saw it. The same woman, standing on the shoulder of the road. Jason's blood ran cold. It was impossible. She was miles behind him. He'd seen her walk into the woods. This time she wasn't facing him. Her back was to the car, her head tilted slightly to one side. As Jason passed, her head turned slowly, unnaturally, following his car until she was out of sight. The highway vanishes. Jason's hands shook as he tightened his grip on the wheel. His eyes flicked to the gas gauge. It was dipping closer to empty. Impossible. He hadn't driven far enough to burn through that much fuel. He decided to call someone, anyone, to calm himself. He reached for his phone, but the screen was blank. Dead. Ahead, the road seemed to narrow. The trees pressed closer, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. The asphalt looked rougher, older, as if it hadn't been maintained in decades. Then, just as suddenly, the road opened up again. Jason blinked. He was back at the bend where he'd first seen the woman. He slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. He looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The same stretch of road, the same trees. The passenger. Jason decided he couldn't keep driving in circles. He pulled over to the shoulder, his headlights cutting into the forest. He leaned back, closing his eyes to steady his nerves. A soft creak jolted him upright. The passenger door was open. Jason's breath hitched. He hadn't heard the door unlock. Before he could react, the door slammed shut. The car rocked slightly, as if someone had gotten inside. Jason didn't dare look. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Drive," a voice whispered from the back seat. It was soft, almost a breath, but it was unmistakable. Jason's instincts took over. He slammed the car into drive and sped down the road, the tires squealing against the pavement. The end of the road. The light in his rearview mirror grew brighter, chasing him down the highway. Jason didn't look back. He focused on the road, his pulse racing. Finally, the road ended, not at a town, but at a wall of fog that swallowed the highway whole. Jason slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop just before the mist. The voice came again, calm and quiet. "You can't leave." Jason turned, but the back seat was empty. The fog crept closer, engulfing the car, until Jason could see nothing but white. When the car was found days later, it was empty, the keys still in the ignition. Locals say if you drive Route 61 at night, you might see Jason's car, headlights dim, still searching for a way out. Tom Myers was used to long drives. As a travelling salesman, the open road had been his companion for years. But tonight, something about the air felt heavier, the darkness thicker. The glowing numbers on the dashboard read 11:47 p.m. as he guided his car onto an isolated stretch of highway. His route took him through miles of desolate forest, the kind of place where civilization felt like a distant memory. The road was lifeless except for the faint hum of his tires on the cracked asphalt. Tom tried the radio, but static greeted him on every channel. Resigned to the silence, he leaned back in his seat and focused on the winding road ahead. The figure on the road. Tom's headlights swept over a curve, and that's when he saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. He slammed on the brakes, his heart leaping to his throat. The car screeched to a halt just feet from the figure. A woman, pale and barefoot, wearing a tattered white dress. Tom rolled down his window cautiously. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman raised her head, revealing a face that was strikingly beautiful yet unnervingly hollow. Her wide eyes looked through him rather than at him. "My car broke down," she said softly. "Can you take me to the next town?" Tom hesitated. The next town was over 50 miles away, and something about her felt off. But he couldn't just leave her stranded. He unlocked the passenger door. "Get in." She climbed in without a word, her movements slow and deliberate, the silent passenger. Tom tried to make small talk as they drove, but the woman gave little more than one-word answers. Her gaze was fixed on the road ahead, her expression unreadable. "What were you doing out here so late?" Tom asked, trying to mask the unease creeping into his voice. "Just trying to get home," she murmured. "Where's home?" "Further," she said cryptically. Tom decided to drop the subject. The road stretched on endlessly, flanked by towering trees that seemed to close in as they went. He checked his rearview mirror, but the darkness behind them was impenetrable. The flickering lights. Minutes passed, and Tom noticed something strange. The headlights seemed to flicker, their glow dimming momentarily before returning to full strength. "Probably just a loose connection," he muttered to himself. "Or something else," the woman said, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper. Tom glanced at her, startled. Her eyes hadn't moved from the road, but her tone sent a chill down his spine. "Do you know this road?" she asked suddenly. "Not really," Tom admitted. "It's a shortcut I found on the map." "It's not on most maps," she said, her voice carrying an edge he couldn't place. The shimmering light. As they rounded another bend, Tom saw a faint glow ahead. At first he thought it was another car, but the light didn't behave like headlights. It hovered in the air, bobbing slightly, like a lantern floating in the breeze. Tom slowed the car, his curiosity piqued. "Don't stop," the woman said sharply, her tone a stark contrast to her earlier demeanour. Tom hesitated but decided to press on. The light grew brighter as they approached, then blinked out of existence, leaving the road even darker than before. The loop. Tom glanced at the clock. 12:17 a.m. That couldn't be right. He'd been driving for at least 30 minutes since picking her up. A sinking feeling settled in his chest. He looked around, and his stomach dropped. The road ahead looked identical to the stretch he had driven earlier. The same curve, the same overhanging branches, even the same pothole he had dodged 20 minutes ago. "We've been here before," Tom said, his voice shaky. "It's the road," the woman replied, her tone devoid of emotion. "What do you mean, the road?" "It doesn't let you leave." Tom felt a chill crawl up his spine. The shadow in the fog, the headlights began to flicker more frequently now, plunging them into darkness for seconds at a time. Each time they came back on, Tom thought he saw movement in the trees. Then, through the fog ahead, a shadow emerged. It was tall and indistinct, standing in the middle of the road. Tom's foot hovered over the brake, his instincts screaming at him to stop. But when the headlights flickered back on, the shadow was gone. "Keep driving," the woman said, her voice eerily calm. The empty seat. As they drove, Tom felt a growing pressure in his chest. The silence was unbearable, and the unease in the pit of his stomach had turned into outright fear. He glanced at the woman, hoping for some reassurance. She was gone. The passenger seat was empty, as if she'd never been there at all. Tom slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. His breathing was ragged as he scanned the road, the trees, the mirror. Nothing. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, the engine idling softly. The final stretch. Gathering his nerve, Tom started driving again. The road seemed different now, narrower, darker, the trees pressing closer as if trying to swallow him whole. Ahead, the glowing light reappeared, larger and brighter than before. It filled the entire road, forcing Tom to stop. As he stared into the light, he heard her voice again, whispering from the back seat. "You can't leave." Tom whipped around, but the back seat was empty. When he turned back to the road, the light engulfed him. The aftermath. Tom's car was found the next morning by a highway patrolman. It was parked on the side of the road, the engine off and the driver's seat empty. Locals tell stories of that road, warning travellers to avoid it at night. They say it's a place where time bends and shadows move, where lost souls wander and hitchhikers disappear. And if you ever see a pale woman in a white dress standing by the side of the road, don't stop. Just keep driving. Emily rounded a corner, the wheels of her sedan screeching slightly on the damp pavement. She didn't notice it at first, but when she glanced to her left, she saw a figure standing by the side of the road. She jolted in her seat. It was a man, tall with a dark hood over his head, his face hidden. His posture was stiff, unnaturally so, like he was frozen in place. For a moment, Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She considered stopping, offering help. It was strange, yes, but it was a small town. People were usually friendly enough. Still, there was something off about him. She pressed the gas pedal, telling herself that it wasn't her problem. Maybe he was waiting for a ride, but there was no reason for her to get involved. As she drove away, she stole a quick glance in the rearview mirror. To her horror, the man was standing in the same position, watching her as the distance grew between them. His head remained still, his eyes fixed on her car, unmoving. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She tried to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. The unseen presence. A few minutes passed and Emily tried to focus on the road. The fog was thick now, swirling in patches. Her headlights barely illuminated the asphalt ahead, and she felt a rising sense of unease. It wasn't just the figure by the road that bothered her. It was the feeling that something was watching her. She glanced in the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see the man still there, but the road behind her was empty. Yet, there was something else. The silence. The usual sounds of a late-night drive, distant rustling leaves, the occasional animals scurrying, were gone. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the only sound was the steady hum of her engine and the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers. She tried to shake it off, telling herself she was imagining things. The fog was playing tricks on her mind. But then, a low, eerie noise filled the car. A tapping, soft at first, like a faint knock on the window. Emily froze. She glanced to her left, but there was nothing there. The window was clear, the glass untouched. Her pulse quickened. It couldn't have been from outside. The tapping came again, this time louder, more insistent. She looked to her right, and there in the corner of her vision a shadow passed by the window. Her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone in the car. The detour. Desperate to shake off the panic, Emily pressed on the accelerator, trying to speed past the unsettling feeling that seemed to cling to her. The road wound through the forest, and as she turned another corner, the fog thickened. The landscape seemed to stretch into infinity, no end in sight. That's when she noticed something strange. A small sign, barely visible through the mist. It read, "Dead End." She had driven this road before, countless times, and she knew it didn't end here. There was no sign of any dead-end roads on the map, and yet the sign was there, a warning she couldn't ignore. Her heart raced as the car began to slow. Without thinking, she made the turn, following the path that seemed to stretch on forever. The feeling of being watched only grew stronger, and her grip on the wheel tightened. The road was growing darker, the fog more suffocating. Every corner seemed to lead into another, as though she was driving in circles. When she glanced at the GPS, it showed a simple message: recalculating. She tapped the screen frantically. It should have been impossible for the road to disappear from the map entirely, but it was as though the world was swallowing her up. The flash of light minutes passed, maybe more, and the dread gnawing at her grew unbearable. The road twisted endlessly, the car creeping forward at a snail's pace. She checked the clock again, 11:58 p.m. How could she have been driving for almost 20 minutes, but still be on the same road? The low tapping came again, but this time it was louder, harsher. There was a scratching sound now, like fingernails dragging across the window. Emily's heart pounded so loudly in her chest that she thought she might pass out. Her breath was shallow, and her skin prickled with terror. Suddenly, the car's lights flickered, then shut off completely. "Shit!" Emily cried out, frantically turning the key in the ignition. Nothing. The car was dead. Her panic set in. She grabbed her phone, but the signal was gone. No bars, no connection. She looked out of the window. The fog seemed to thicken, pressing against the glass. And then, just as she turned her head back, there was a figure standing in front of the car. A man. But this time he wasn't on the side of the road. He was in the middle of the path, standing so close that if she'd had her lights on, she would have seen his face. He wasn't moving. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She froze, staring at the figure through the glass. His clothes were tattered, his face obscured by shadows, but his presence seemed suffocating, like he was pulling her toward him with an invisible force. And then, the window of the car rattled. The tapping continued, louder now, as though something, or someone, was trying to get in. The final moment. With her pulse racing, Emily quickly threw open the car door and bolted into the fog, her feet slipping on the wet ground as she ran. She could hear her breath, ragged and quick, but the sound of her steps was drowned out by the ever-present scratching, growing closer with every step. Her legs burned, but she didn't stop. She had to escape. Just when she thought she might collapse, she spotted a faint light through the trees. Headlights. A car. She ran toward it, desperate, but as she neared, the headlights flickered and disappeared, vanishing into the thick mist, and then everything went black. The next morning, a search team was dispatched after a call about a missing woman. Emily's car was found abandoned on the road. The engine was still running, but there was no sign of Emily anywhere nearby. The doors were unlocked, and the interior lights flickered faintly. The police couldn't explain what happened. No one had seen Emily. There were no footprints in the dirt, no sign of a struggle, just the empty car and a faint, lingering chill in the air. And to this day, no one has ever found Emily Thompson. Her name is just another forgotten story whispered by those who drive the roads at night. It was supposed to be a simple drive. Kevin Moore had made this trip countless times before, a late-night run from his office in the city to his parents' house in the countryside. The road was familiar, a 2-hour journey through winding highways and empty rural roads. Tonight, however, something felt different. Kevin left the city at 10 p.m., his car packed with a small overnight bag and a thermos of coffee. The first leg of the journey was uneventful, the highway buzzing with the occasional car passing in the opposite direction. He set his cruise control and let the steady rhythm of the drive ease his thoughts. After about an hour, he reached the turnoff to Route 17, a quiet stretch of road that snaked through a dense forest. He always felt a twinge of unease when he drove this road at night. The trees crowded close to the pavement, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The only light came from his headlights, cutting narrow beams through the suffocating darkness. Kevin switched on his high beams and turned up the radio, hoping to drown out the creeping feeling of isolation. The forest was eerily silent, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears and made you feel small. He hadn't seen another car in over 20 minutes. The lone figure. As Kevin rounded a bend, his headlights caught a figure standing on the shoulder of the road. It was a man, dressed in dark clothing, waving one arm as if trying to flag him down. Kevin's first instinct was to stop. He slowed the car, his hand moving toward the window controls. But as he got closer, something about the man made him hesitate. The figure was unnaturally tall, his limbs too long and thin. His face was pale, almost luminous in the darkness, and his eyes. Kevin couldn't describe them. They didn't reflect the headlights like normal eyes would. Instead, they seemed to absorb the light, pulling it into an endless void. Kevin's foot pressed down on the accelerator before he even realized what he was doing. The car sped past the figure, the man's arm still raised, his head turning to follow Kevin as he drove by. Kevin's heart was pounding. He glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure receding into the distance, but there was nothing there. The road behind him was empty, the static voice. Kevin shook his head, trying to convince himself it was a trick of the light or his overactive imagination. He reached for his thermos and took a sip of coffee, the bitter liquid grounding him. The radio crackled suddenly, cutting off the soft rock station he had been listening to. Kevin frowned and adjusted the dial, but the static persisted. Then, through the static, he heard a voice. "Don't stop." Kevin froze. The voice was faint, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. "Keep driving." His hands tightened on the steering wheel. He turned the radio off, but the voice lingered in his mind. The empty road. The next few miles passed in tense silence. Kevin tried to focus on the road, but his eyes kept flicking to the mirrors. The feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. He checked his phone for a signal, hoping to call someone, anyone, but there was no service. Just the no signal notification glaring back at him. A soft thud jolted him from his thoughts. He looked ahead and saw something dart across the road, just beyond the reach of his headlights. It was too fast for him to make out any details, but it was big. Bigger than any animal he expected to see in the forest. He slowed the car, his eyes scanning the darkness. The trees on either side of the road were still, their shadows stretching across the pavement. As he crept forward, the thud came again, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the road, it was coming from the roof of his car. The passenger Kevin's breath caught in his throat. He kept his hands on the wheel, his eyes darting up to the rearview mirror. Another thud, followed by the sound of something scraping against metal. Kevin's instincts screamed at him to stop, to get out and look, but the voice from the radio echoed in his mind. "Don't stop." He pressed down on the accelerator, the engine roaring as the car sped down the road. The scraping sound grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was on the roof was trying to hold on. Then, as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. Kevin dared a glance in the mirror. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow moving along the back window, but it was gone before he could be sure. The fork in the road. A few miles later, Kevin spotted a fork in the road ahead. The right path was the usual route to his parents' house, but the left was a detour he had never taken. He frowned. There shouldn't have been a fork here. His GPS screen flickered, the map glitching before the device shut off completely. Kevin's frustration was quickly replaced by a gnawing dread. The road signs were blank. No names, no directions, just two black arrows pointing left and right. Kevin hesitated, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. The forest felt oppressive now, the darkness pressing in from all sides. He glanced at the left path, its curve disappearing into the shadows. Something about it felt wrong. He turned right, choosing the familiar road. The loop. The sense of relief Kevin felt was short-lived. After a few minutes of driving, he noticed something strange. The road ahead looked familiar, too familiar. He rounded a bend and saw the fork again. Kevin's stomach dropped. It was impossible. He had just passed this spot. He chose the right path again, his pulse quickening as he sped down the road. But no matter how far he drove, the fork kept appearing. The third time he reached it, he stopped the car and stared at the two paths. The forest was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. "Just a trick of the mind," he muttered, though his voice wavered. He chose the left path this time. The endless drive. The left road was narrower, the trees closer. Kevin's headlights barely pierced the darkness. The air seemed colder, and the shadows seemed to shift and writhe at the edges of his vision. His speedometer began to flicker, the needle jumping erratically. The car shuddered as if the road beneath it wasn't entirely solid. Kevin gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard, but it was blank. He had no idea how long he'd been driving when he saw the figure again. It stood in the middle of the road this time, its pale face tilted toward him. Kevin slammed on the brakes, but the car didn't stop. The figure didn't move as the car hurtled toward it. Just before impact, the headlights flickered, and the figure vanished. Kevin's car skidded to a halt. The return, when the headlights stabilized, Kevin realized he was back at the fork. This time, there were no blank signs. Instead, there was a single message painted in bold red letters across both paths. "You can't leave." Kevin's chest tightened. He turned the car around, heading back the way he came, but the road stretched on endlessly. The familiar bend never appeared, and the forest never thinned. Kevin kept driving, his gas tank slowly depleting, the darkness growing thicker with every mile. And somewhere in the distance, just beyond the reach of his headlights, he could see the figure waiting for him. Kevin was never seen again. Local authorities found his car abandoned weeks later, the gas tank empty and the engine cold. Inside, the radio was stuck on static, and the dashboard clock was frozen at 11:37 p.m., the exact moment he had entered Route 17. It was supposed to be a routine drive, nothing more. David Thorne was heading home from his sister's house after an evening spent helping her set up her new computer. The highway was empty, the time just past midnight, and the air hung heavy with that peculiar stillness that only comes in the deepest hours of the night. David didn't mind night drives. In fact, he often found them soothing. The hum of the engine, the rhythmic blur of the road, and the absence of traffic all combined into a sort of meditative calm. But tonight was different. There was a strange tension in the air, an inexplicable weight that he couldn't shake. The dashboard clock read 12:07 a.m. as David turned onto Route 63, a long, straight stretch of road that cut through dense, unbroken forest for miles. It was the fastest way home, though it had always given him an uneasy feeling. The first glitch. The drive was quiet, too quiet. Even with the windows cracked, there was no sound of crickets or the occasional rustle of leaves, just the hum of his tires on the asphalt and the faint buzz of the car's electronics. David glanced at his phone on the passenger seat. No service. He frowned but brushed it off. It wasn't unusual out here. 10 minutes later, he noticed something odd. The dashboard clock still read 12:07 a.m. He tapped it, thinking it was a glitch, but the numbers didn't change. A chill crept up his spine. Then the headlights flickered. It was just a brief stutter, but it was enough to make David tighten his grip on the wheel. He muttered a curse and glanced at his rearview mirror. The road behind him was empty, swallowed by the blackness of the night. The hitchhiker. As he rounded a gentle curve, his headlights illuminated something ahead, a figure standing at the side of the road. David's heart skipped a beat. It was a man, waving one arm, his silhouette barely visible against the darkness. Against his better judgment, David slowed the car and rolled down the window slightly. "Hey, you okay?" The man stepped closer, his face coming into view. He looked disheveled, his clothes torn and dirty, and his expression was one of desperate urgency. "My car broke down," the man said. "Can you give me a ride to the next town?" David hesitated, glancing at the empty road ahead. There was something about the man that made him uneasy, but he couldn't just leave him stranded. "Yeah, sure," David said finally. "Hop in." The man climbed into the passenger seat, his movements stiff and jerky. As he settled in, David caught a whiff of something metallic and sharp, like rusted iron. The uncomfortable silence. David tried to make small talk as they drove, but the man was curt and evasive. "What's your name?" David asked, glancing over. "Call me Mike," the man said, staring straight ahead. "Where are you heading?" "Doesn't matter anymore," Mike muttered. David felt a flicker of annoyance. "Look, I'm doing you a favor here. You could at least—" "Stop the car," Mike interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp. "What? Why?" "Just stop the car," Mike said again, his tone low and insistent. David's stomach twisted, but he pulled over to the side of the road. The headlights illuminated the empty stretch of asphalt ahead, and the surrounding forest seemed to press closer, the trees casting long, claw-like shadows. Mike opened the door and stepped out, turning to face David. "You need to leave this road," he said, his voice flat. David frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Turn around and go back the way you came," Mike said. "Don't stop for anything, don't slow down." and with that, he disappeared into the woods, his figure swallowed by the darkness. The loop shaken, David got back on the road. He couldn't explain why, but he followed Mike's advice, turning the car around and heading back the way he'd come. Minutes passed, but nothing looked familiar. The road stretched on endlessly, the trees on either side blurring into a monotonous wall of black. David glanced at the clock. It still read 12:07 a.m. Panic began to creep in. He checked his phone again. No service. Then he saw it. The same figure standing on the side of the road, waving. It was Mike. David's blood ran cold. His hands gripped the wheel as he drove past, refusing to stop this time. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but Mike was gone. The shadows in the trees. As the road stretched on, David became acutely aware of the shadows in the trees. They moved, shifting and writhing as if alive. The headlights flickered again, plunging the road into darkness for a heartbeat before returning. In that brief moment, David thought he saw something, a figure standing in the middle of the road. When the lights returned, the figure was gone. His breathing quickened. He pressed down on the accelerator, desperate to get off this cursed stretch of highway. The end that never comes. No matter how far he drove, the road never changed. The same bends, the same shadows, the same suffocating darkness. And then, up ahead, he saw something that made his heart stop. His own car, parked on the side of the road, the headlights off and the driver's seat empty. David pulled over, his mind racing. He got out and approached the car cautiously. The door was unlocked, and as he opened it, he was hit by a wave of cold air. Inside, the dashboard clock read 12:07 a.m., the last ride. David stumbled back to his own car and drove off, his mind a whirl of confusion and terror. The shadows seemed closer now, their movements more frantic, as if they were trying to reach him. He drove for hours, or maybe minutes. Time had lost all meaning. The road stretched on endlessly, an unbroken ribbon of black, the trees looming like silent witnesses to his growing despair. And then, in the rearview mirror, he saw Mike sitting in the back seat, his hollow eyes staring back at him. "You didn't leave," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. David screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. The next morning, Route 63 was empty, save for a single abandoned car. The driver's seat was empty, the engine cold, and the clock on the dashboard still read 12:07 a.m. Locals say the road is cursed, a trap for those who dare to travel it after dark. They warn never to stop, never to turn back, and never, ever to trust the hitchhiker. It was a quiet night when Ethan Carter left his friend's house after a long evening of drinks and conversation. The clock in his truck dashboard glowed a dull 1:23 a.m. The winding country roads, lined by darkened trees and the occasional farmhouse, stretched out in front of him like an endless tunnel. He had taken this route countless times before, though never quite this late, and the isolation of the stretch made it feel a little different tonight. Ethan hadn't been drinking much, just a couple of beers, but it was enough to make him tired. He rubbed his eyes, trying to stay awake as he gripped the steering wheel, trying to shake off the drowsiness. It was supposed to be a short trip, maybe 30 minutes, before he'd be back in his small apartment and could finally get some rest. But, as the road seemed to stretch out endlessly ahead of him, the stillness began to feel oppressive. He passed the last few houses for miles and entered a long stretch of open road. The road was narrow, with trees encroaching on both sides. No streetlights, no signs, just the quiet of the night surrounding him. His truck's engine hummed steadily, and the headlights sliced through the thick fog that had begun to settle over the road. Ethan felt a chill in the air despite the truck's heating system running full blast. The fog was thick now, and the white beam of his headlights barely cut through the haze. As he drove, the road twisted, forcing him to slow down even more. The trees along the roadside stood like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the wind. That was when he saw it, a figure standing by the side of the road. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure if it was just a trick of the fog, but the figure looked like a person, standing still, facing the road, not moving at all. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. He slowed down and squinted his eyes, trying to make out more details. It was a man, or at least, it looked like one. He was tall, dressed in a dark jacket, and his face was hidden in the shadows. Ethan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He was alone on this road, miles away from the nearest town. The only reason someone would be out here at this time of night would be if their car had broken down, but there was no sign of one. Ethan's truck slowed even further as he got closer to the figure. Something about it seemed wrong, unnatural. It wasn't just the loneliness of the road. It was something else, something unsettling. He rolled the window down a crack, just enough to call out to the stranger. "Hey, are you all right?" Ethan asked, his voice echoing in the quiet night. There was no response. The figure didn't move, didn't turn to acknowledge him. Ethan frowned. He considered stopping. Maybe the person needed help, or maybe it was someone who'd gotten lost in the fog. But as he came closer, a sense of unease washed over him. There was something about the figure that felt wrong. He sped up slightly, trying to pass by, but the figure remained still, its presence so stark against the dimly lit fog. Just as he was about to drive past, the figure took a step forward, its feet hitting the asphalt with an eerie slowness. Ethan slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt just inches from the stranger. His heart was pounding now, his breath shallow. The figure stood motionless in front of the truck, blocking his path. "Hey!" Ethan shouted, his voice cracking. "What the hell is going on?" The man didn't speak. His head remained down, hidden in the shadows, but Ethan could swear he saw movement, like the man was slowly tilting his head upward, inch by inch. A cold sweat broke out on Ethan's forehead. He couldn't move, couldn't think. Every instinct screamed at him to drive away, but he was frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, the figure's head snapped upward. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The man's face was pale, almost sickly white, his eyes wide open but empty, as if staring into the void. His skin was taut, stretched over his face like a mask. His mouth hung slightly open, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too uneven. And then the figure began to move again. This time it was different. It wasn't a slow, deliberate motion. It was quick, jerky, unnatural. The man lunged forward, his arms reaching out toward the truck, his fingers twisted and bent at odd angles. Ethan didn't think, he just acted. He slammed the truck in reverse, his tires squealing on the wet road. His heart was racing, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the gear shift. But when he looked up, the figure was gone. No sign of it anywhere on the road. Ethan's mind raced as he backed up further down the road, eyes darting everywhere, searching for the figure. His breath was ragged, his body trembling with adrenaline. He finally stopped the truck and turned the wheel, deciding to head back to the main highway, hoping to find other cars or signs of life. He drove faster now, the fog still clinging to the road, but the feeling of being watched persisted. His eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, certain that the figure was following him, that somehow it was closer than before. Minutes felt like hours as he pressed the pedal to the floor, his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel. He wanted to scream, but his throat was dry, his mind too frantic to form coherent thoughts. Just as he thought he might make it back to the highway, the engine sputtered. The truck jerked, and then nothing. The engine died, leaving him in complete silence, alone in the dark. Ethan sat frozen in the truck, the lights of the dashboard casting an eerie glow over his pale face. He tried the engine again. Nothing. His mind raced. What now? What had happened? The figure was still out there, somewhere. He reached for his phone, but it was dead. Not a single bar. Suddenly a sound broke the silence. A scratching, like fingers dragging across metal. Ethan's blood ran cold. The sound was coming from the back of the truck. He turned slowly, his heart hammering in his chest, and saw a shadow moving across the rear window. Something, or someone, was out there. The figure from before. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had nowhere to go. The scratching sound grew louder, more frantic, and then the voice. "Let me in!" Ethan's mind screamed. There was no way he was staying there any longer. He threw the truck into drive and slammed his foot on the accelerator. But as he sped off into the night, the figure remained, just a shadow in the rearview mirror, watching him drive away. It was supposed to be a quick trip. Emily Monroe had planned to leave her small-town job at the diner after her evening shift and make the 2-hour drive to visit her family in the neighboring city. It wasn't the first time she'd made the drive at night, and she usually enjoyed the solitude. The open road, her favorite playlist, and the hum of her old sedan always seemed to clear her mind. But tonight was different. The clock on the dashboard blinked 11:37 p.m. as Emily pulled out onto Route 84, the long stretch of two-lane highway that cut through miles of forest and farmland. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light barely filtering through the thick layer of clouds. There were no streetlights on this road, and Emily had only seen a handful of other cars since she left town. Her headlights illuminated the asphalt ahead, the yellow lines stretching into the darkness. The trees on either side of the road loomed like shadowy sentinels, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. Emily turned up the volume on her playlist, trying to shake the creeping unease that had settled in her chest. The night was unusually quiet. Even with her windows rolled up, Emily could feel the stillness pressing against the car. No chirping crickets, no distant howls from coyotes, just silence. The first glimpse. About 45 minutes into her drive, Emily saw something strange on the side of the road. At first, it looked like an animal, maybe a deer, standing just at the edge of her headlight's reach. She slowed down, squinting to get a better look. As her car approached, the figure moved. But it didn't move like a deer or any other animal she had seen before. It was upright, tall and lanky, its limbs too long and its movements too fluid. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Her instinct told her to keep driving, and she pressed harder on the accelerator. As she sped past, she caught a brief glimpse of its face, or what should have been its face. Instead, there was only darkness, as if the thing's head was a void that absorbed all light. Emily's heart pounded as she glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing there. The road behind her was empty, the trees unmoving. She shook her head, trying to dismiss what she had seen. "It's late. I'm just tired," she thought. But no matter how much she tried to convince herself, the image of the shadowy figure lingered in her mind. The shadow follows, Emily's unease grew as the miles ticked by. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The darkness outside her car seemed thicker now, as if the night itself was closing in on her. The radio suddenly cut out, replaced by static. Emily frowned and reached to adjust the dial, but no matter what station she tried, the static persisted. Then, faintly, she heard something beneath the static, a voice. "Don't stop." Her hand froze on the dial. The voice was faint, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It repeated the words again, clearer this time. "Don't stop." Emily's pulse quickened. She turned off the radio completely, the sudden silence in the car almost deafening. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. That's when she saw the shadow again. It darted across the road, too fast for her to make out any details. Emily slammed on the brakes, her tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt. Her breathing was ragged as she scanned the road in front of her. There was nothing there. But then she saw it. Movement in the trees. The shadowy figure was there, weaving between the trunks, moving closer. Emily didn't wait to see what it would do. She floored the gas pedal, the engine roaring as the car sped down the highway. The dead end, Emily's heart didn't stop racing, even after she'd put several miles between herself and the figure. She kept glancing in her mirrors, half expecting to see it chasing her, but the road remained empty. She tried to calm herself, taking deep breaths and focusing on the steady rhythm of the tires on the asphalt. But as she turned a sharp corner, her headlights illuminated something that made her blood run cold. The road ahead was blocked. A massive tree had fallen across both lanes, its gnarled branches stretching out like skeletal fingers. Emily hit the brakes, her car coming to a stop just a few feet from the obstruction. She sat there, gripping the steering wheel tightly, her mind racing. She hadn't passed any turnoffs or side roads for miles. There was no way around the tree. She glanced at her phone, hoping to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. Out here in the middle of nowhere, she might as well have been on another planet. As she sat there, trying to figure out what to do, she became aware of a sound. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer, a low, guttural growl. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She turned her head slowly, her eyes scanning the darkness outside her car. That's when she saw it. The figure was standing just a few feet away from her car, its tall, lanky frame illuminated by the headlights. It didn't move, but Emily could feel its gaze, empty and oppressive, like a weight pressing down on her chest. The growling grew louder, and Emily realized it wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from the darkness around it. Shadows began to move, slithering across the ground like living things. They twisted and writhed, converging on the figure until it was surrounded by a swirling mass of darkness. The chase. Emily didn't wait to see what would happen next. She threw the car into reverse, her tires squealing as she backed away from the fallen tree. She turned the wheel sharply, spinning the car around, and sped back the way she had come. The shadows followed. She could see them in her mirrors, spilling onto the road like a flood of ink. The figure was at their center, its movements unnaturally fast as it pursued her. Emily's foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, the speedometer climbing as she raced down the highway. The car's engine roared, but it didn't feel fast enough. The shadows were gaining. The radio crackled to life again, the static louder this time. The voice returned, urgent and clear. "Keep driving, don't let it catch you." Emily didn't need to be told twice. She kept her eyes on the road, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The shadows were almost upon her now, the figure's shape becoming clearer in the rearview mirror. Emily's heart pounded as she spotted a faint light in the distance, a small gas station, its neon sign flickering weakly. The escape. Emily's car screeched into the gas station's parking lot, the bright lights cutting through the darkness. She threw the car into park and bolted from the driver's seat, sprinting toward the building. The door chimed as she burst inside, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. The clerk behind the counter looked up, startled. "Mum, are you okay?" Emily turned to look out the window, expecting to see the shadows swarming the parking lot. But the darkness had stopped just beyond the edge of the gas station's lights, writhing and pulsing like a living thing. The figure stood at the edge of the light, its hollow face turned toward her. It didn't move. Emily backed away from the window, her hands trembling. The clerk followed her gaze, his expression turning to one of confusion. "What are you looking at?" he asked. Emily turned to him, her voice shaking. "You don't see it?" He shook his head, glancing out the window again. "See what?" When Emily looked back, the figure was gone, but she knew it wasn't over. Whatever it was, it would be waiting for her on the road, and next time she might not be so lucky. Sarah Mitchell had always loved the open road. As a freelance graphic designer, her work allowed her the flexibility to travel, and she often found inspiration in the solitude of long drives. Tonight, however, the familiar comfort of the highway felt different. It was a clear night, the moon casting a silvery glow on Route 22, a stretch of highway that cut through dense forests and rolling hills. She had left her friend's house in the small town of Maplewood after a late dinner, her mind buzzing with ideas for a new project. Her sedan, a reliable 2015 Toyota Camry, purred smoothly as she merged onto the highway, the dashboard lights illuminating her focused expression. The first few hours passed without incident. Sarah enjoyed the rhythmic sound of the tires on the asphalt and the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. She listened to her favorite playlist, losing herself in the melodies and lyrics that always seemed to spark her creativity. As midnight approached, the landscape began to change. The trees grew thicker, their silhouettes dark against the night sky. The road curved sharply, winding through a particularly dense forest known locally as Blackwood Forest. Sarah had driven this route many times, but tonight, an inexplicable feeling of unease settled over her. Her phone buzzed with a notification, a reminder of a meeting scheduled for the next morning. She glanced at the time, 11:45 p.m. Realizing she had plenty of time before dawn, she decided to take a short break at a rest stop she rarely used. The sign read Whispering Pines Rest Area, a name that seemed fitting for the eerie stillness surrounding it. Sarah pulled into the empty lot, the headlights of her car cutting through the darkness. She turned off the engine and stepped out, stretching her legs. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth. The rest area was deserted, the only sign of life being the distant hoot of an owl. She grabbed a bottle of water from her bag and took a sip, her eyes scanning the area. There was no one else in sight, just the vast expanse of forest encircling the rest stop. She checked her phone for signal but found nothing. No bars, no reception. Shrugging it off, she decided to use the restroom before continuing her journey. The restroom was small and dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering intermittently. Sarah quickly finished and returned to her car, noticing a faint rustling sound coming from the woods behind her. She turned to look but saw nothing, just the dense trees swaying gently in the night breeze. Shaking off the feeling of unease, she settled back into her seat and started the engine. As she pulled back onto the highway, the road seemed to stretch endlessly before her, the darkness of Blackwood Forest looming on either side. She turned her attention back to the road, but the rustling sound persisted, growing louder and more distinct. Sarah's heart raced as she glanced in the rearview mirror. A shadow moved swiftly between the trees, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. She pressed her foot harder on the accelerator, hoping to outrun whatever, or whoever, was following her. The car responded smoothly, speeding down the highway. Minutes turned into what felt like hours, the only sounds now the roar of the engine and the unsettling noises from the forest. Suddenly, her headlights caught something in the distance, a figure standing on the side of the road, illuminated by the beam. It was tall, dressed in a dark coat, and its face was obscured by the shadows of a wide-brimmed hat. Sarah's grip tightened on the steering wheel. The figure didn't move, just stood there watching her. She considered pulling over, but fear kept her foot firmly on the gas pedal. Instead, she tried to focus on the road ahead, praying it was just a tired traveler seeking a ride. As she passed the figure, it remained motionless. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message, "Don't stop." Her blood ran cold. She glanced down at the message, realizing it had been sent from an unknown number. Panic surged through her as she tried to process what was happening. She sped up, the car racing through the winding road, the figure still visible in her rearview mirror, now moving alongside her vehicle. It mirrored her speed effortlessly, its presence growing more menacing with each passing second. Sarah's mind raced. Should she confront it? Should she try to escape? Deciding that confrontation was too risky, she pushed the car to its limits, tires squealing as she navigated the sharp turns of Blackwood Forest. The shadowy figure remained by her side, relentless and unyielding. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing her fear. Suddenly, her car's engine began to sputter, the power dipping as she struggled to maintain speed. She glanced back and saw the figure inch closer, its outline becoming clearer in the dim light. It raised a hand, and Sarah saw a glint of something metallic, perhaps a knife. Desperation took over. She floored the accelerator, but the car couldn't respond. It stalled, coasting to a stop in the middle of the highway. The figure loomed over her car, its presence suffocating. Sarah's mind raced for a plan, but the terror paralyzed her. The figure leaned in, and she could see its face now. Hollow eyes staring back at her, an expression of pure malice. "Why are you driving through Blackwood?" it hissed, voice barely above a whisper yet filled with menace. Sarah tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. She could only nod, tears streaming down her face. The figure reached out, pressing its cold hand against the window. She could feel the chill emanating from its touch, the glass seeming to freeze under its contact. Without warning, the figure vanished into thin air, the air around her growing warm and heavy. The car's engine roared back to life, and she felt an inexplicable urge to drive again. She didn't question it. She just pressed the accelerator, fleeing from the nightmare that had momentarily possessed her reality. As she sped down the highway, the darkness seemed to lift, the first hints of dawn breaking on the horizon. The forest on either side of the road began to thin, revealing a stretch of open land bathed in the soft light of day. The shadows and fear dissolved, replaced by relief and exhaustion. Finally, she reached the outskirts of her destination, the city lights welcoming her back from the depths of Blackwood Forest. She pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, the nightmare of the night fading into a distant, terrifying memory. Inside, she collapsed into a booth, her hands shaking as she ordered a coffee. The waitress gave her a sympathetic smile, unaware of the horror Sarah had just endured. She took a sip, the warmth of the drink soothing her frayed nerves. As she sat there, gathering her thoughts, she glanced out the window one last time. The highway stretched out behind her, peaceful and silent once more. But deep down, she knew that some roads were meant to remain unexplored after dark, their secrets hidden within the shadows of the night. And from that day on, Sarah never drove through Blackwood Road again, forever haunted by the memory of the midnight figure that had pursued her through the darkness.